So when something like this lens comes along, something relatively inexpensive, I'm using the word relatively because I don't know your financial situation, but I'd say this is a relatively inexpensive lens. Sometimes we're a little bit quick to relegate something like this to the category of it's a good beginner lens, it's a good entry point, it's a good stepping stone to maybe something better in the future. Marketers, advertisers, they come up with this sort of stuff to sell us the next best thing, or at least make us feel as though whatever we have is inferior to something else that's out there, something else that we should be aspiring to, typically something more expensive, obviously. I worked in advertising. It's part of the reason why I left advertising. I don't really want to be part of that machine, although that's how capitalism works to some extent, right? So many of you out there probably know from buying and selling camera equipment that when you hear something like this, sometimes it's just a load of BS. Well, I'm telling you right now, if someone out there is telling you that this lens can't be your first and last macro lens, that's what they're handing you. Let's get into this.
I'm reinventing myself. I'm me and nobody else. Ooh, I can't help but smile.
Hey there everybody, I hope you're all well. Just Marco here with another one for you. If you didn't gather from that opening, I'm gonna have a lot of positive things to say about this lens, but let's start with a few negatives or things I'm not quite sure about. And to start, this aperture ring. It's declicked. Now, it's not common that a manufacturer would make a macro lens with a declicked aperture. The reason being a declicked aperture is usually for people who intend to shoot video with a lens. I don't know how many people are going to shoot video with this lens. Not that you can't shoot video with this lens, but if you're gonna be doing macro video, for instance, you're not gonna wanna change your aperture mid-shot. And if you're shooting other kinds of video, you'd probably be interested in a completely different lens. You do have the flexibility of doing other kinds of video and photography with this lens because it does have the ability to focus to infinity. So you've got that entire range from infinity to your macro with this lens. Unlike, say, if you were to buy a ultra macro that was a 2 to 5 times macro, for instance, you couldn't be using it for things like portraiture or what have you. And you can with this. Now, whether you'd want to or not, because it doesn't have autofocus, something else some people would say is a negative. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on where I'm going with this. Unfortunately, and kind of ironically, you've got people like myself who know something about macro photography. I'm not an expert like Michael Waddell. I'll get back to him in a second. But Pergear is sending this lens out to people. They may be professional photographers, but unfortunately, many of them don't know anything about macro photography. So you have comments like, this lens isn't good for beginners getting into macro because it has no autofocus. Now, I would argue that if you're a beginner, you certainly don't want to mess with autofocus with your macro lens, and it's not just beginners either. Most people shooting macro aren't going to be touching autofocus. Mind you, autofocus could come in handy. Now, if you've got your camera set up for back button autofocus, where you've got one of your buttons on the back of the camera set to turn on your autofocus, it can help sometimes when you want to find focus quickly. So what you'll do is you'll hit that button on the back of your camera, have your autofocus do like a rough focus first, then you'd let go of that button because it basically just engages while you've got your finger on it. Take your finger off, then focus the rest of the way manually. Although most macro photographers will just be focusing manually, they don't care about autofocus. So to have all these reviews out there about this lens and having autofocus or the lack of autofocus be a negative against this lens as a macro lens, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I can't just leave it there when it comes to autofocus. I do have to mention there is another advantage of having autofocus. If you are a macro photographer, there are probably some of you screaming at me right now who maybe are a little bit more advanced when it comes to macro photography, and you know that there are cameras nowadays that have the ability to do autofocus bracketing. Now, when you get into more advanced macro photography, you'll be doing focus bracketing. One of the challenges of macro photography, I know many of you know this and some of you don't, but for those of you who don't, when you're taking macro photographs, one of the challenges is getting things in focus completely. You may be able to take a photo of an insect and maybe get its eyes in focus, but you're talking about a very shallow focus plane even when you've got your aperture closed down. So you're not using large apertures when you're doing macro photography because you want to increase the depth of field when you're doing macro, but you also don't want to close it down too much, or else then you have the effects of diffraction taking over, which can cause basically an image that's soft. Because once you close that aperture down enough, light coming through a hole that small can cause problems. And so the sweet spot of this lens, for instance, is f8. So ideally you'd want to be shooting at f8 all the time when you're doing macro. And if you're going to keep it at f8, that's one of the reasons I love a clickable aperture. I just love to just set it to f8 and not worry that I'm going to move it. But if you want to shoot at f8 and have your entire subject be in focus, especially if you're at 2x magnification, you're going to want to focus stack. That means taking several images from the foreground to the background, focusing at different points as you go, and then combining those images in software like Photoshop or specialized focus stacking software. Now, so if you have a macro lens with autofocus, cameras like this can be set up so they're taking those multiple photos automatically through the range. If you're a macro photographer and you're doing primarily handheld macro photography, using autofocus bracketing can increase your hit rate, the number of stacks that basically work. It can increase your hit rate by quite a bit, dramatically. And there are photographers who have had great success doing this, especially some of them on the OM system. I had mentioned Michael Waddell. There's another guy, Stuart Wood. I recommend you check out his video too. He actually takes you through all the different methods of focus stacking for beginners. It's a fantastic video, very easy to find. Just look up Stuart Wood and focus stacking for beginners. Check it out. But what you also want if you're going to be doing some autofocus bracketing is a flash that is compatible with your autofocus bracketing. Confession, this is my first dedicated macro lens. Up until this point, I've been using my Tamron 70-300, which isn't even a macro lens. I use it with a Raynox magnifier. It's a Raynox 1.5 times magnifier and extension tubes. And that effectively turns my 70-300 into a very powerful macro lens. It's just very bulky and awkward putting all that stuff together, so I opted to give this a shot. But that lens is autofocus, but I have yet to test the A6700's autofocus bracketing capabilities. With that setup And I am looking forward to doing so in the near future, as well as testing a couple different flashes to see if they're compatible with that feature. So another potential downside of this lens for some of you might be the weight of this thing. It is all metal construction, which is a positive for most people, but it does make it a heavier lens. Actually, maybe another reason why you might want to go with one of those autofocus macro lenses, because they typically are lighter weight. Autofocus macro lenses aren't going to necessarily give you ultra macro capability unless you're using a magnifier. This is a Raynox magnifier. This is their 1.5 time magnifier. It's got this sort of spring-loaded thing on the outside that allows you to fit it on different lenses. All you do is just pop that on there and let go, and it sticks on there quite securely. There's a thread on the inside of that that's a 49 mil, so if you've got a macro lens or any lens that you'd like to make a macro lens that's got a 49 mil filter thread, you can put that on there directly without this thing on the outside. There are going to be some of you who look at that thing, and especially this kind of cheap looking plastic thing on the outside. This is a really good piece of glass. You've got nothing to worry about. Very, very, very sharp optic, and yeah, I recommend that to any of you who, you know, maybe you want to do some macro on the cheap. That is only about 70 bucks. You can actually find that in my Amazon affiliate links if you're interested. Anyway, that's the Raynox right there. Oh, by the way, something Michael Waddell recommended that people use, especially if they're starting out, but he uses one as well, is one of these. It's basically just a diffuser, and that gives you a much softer light source when you're using your flash. Flash hits that, gives you some really, really nice, nice light, and that collapses. It just goes like that, and then it's got a little case. Actually, these stains here aren't dirt. It's actually from the the case. I was out in the rain, and yeah, the dye came off the case onto this. It's not dirt. So on the topic of rain and things potentially getting wet, you may have noticed in that unboxing video that there is no weather sealing gasket on this lens. It has no weather sealing whatsoever, in fact, which is a bit of a downside considering most macro photographers are going to be outside with this lens. So interesting choice that Pergear decided not to put any weather sealing on this lens. I'm going to make sure that it's covered if I'm going out in the rain. It is really nice to get shots of raindrops when you're doing macro. So a little unfortunate that they kind of overlooked that. So I probably should have mentioned this right off the bat if you didn't get it from that unboxing video, but this is the Pergear 60mm f2.8 2-time ultra macro Mark II. But this is the second version of this lens. There was also a prototype of this Mark II lens that went out to reviewers, and one of the criticisms was that there was some lens creep. They fixed that. They've made things a little bit stiffer. I should say, when I was mentioning the declicked aperture, it is stiff enough that it's not going to necessarily move on you. It's not too stiff, it's very smooth, as is the focus. There was some criticism that the focus is a little bit too stiff. Again, when you're doing macro, you're either moving the subject or you're moving the camera to focus, very, very small amounts. You're typically not even touching the focus wheel, or the focus ring, but the focus ring is very smooth. So finally, let's get to some of the positives of this lens. And there are many, but first and foremost, it's very sharp, which is probably one of the most important things you want in a macro lens, right? In that opening sequence where I'm taking a shot of that bug on the plant, not even a real plant, the bug was real. He only measured about not even 1/8 of an inch across, a little less than 3 millimeters for those metric people like myself. So very, very tiny, and filled up a good amount of the frame. Now, if I wanted him to fill up a little more of the frame, I could have put this on, which I actually did for another shot, and that shot is one that I focus stacked. Not very well. I probably could have had more images in the stack because there was sort of a gap between where things got a little bit soft, so I probably could have taken more photos, but I did take a shot with that as well on here, which gives me a 5-time macro. So for those of you who are thinking to yourself, maybe 2 times isn't enough, you can always spend the 70 bucks on one of these Raynox magnifiers and give yourself a little bit more. So anybody who can identify that bug, by the way, I would be grateful. So if there are any entomologists out there who can identify what that bug is, I really dig the colors on the bug. I didn't really see those until I actually took the photo because the thing is so tiny. Another cool thing about this lens is when you focus, it's all internal. You've got this piece of glass on the outside that keeps anything from touching the actual lens element on the inside. So very cool for macro because often you're getting the lens so close to things that you end up touching those things. And to have that piece of glass there and everything moving internally is going to give you a little peace of mind. Another cool thing about this lens is the fact that it is an f2.8. You're not limited to just doing macro photography with it. It will focus to infinity, and with that f2.8 you can get some out of focus backgrounds because it's a 60 mil. So that's really nice. Doing portrait stuff, and of course your close focusing distance is awesome. So it does give you the flexibility of doing other types of photography with this as well, which is very, very cool. So it used to be that Laowa was the only game in town if you wanted full frame coverage with a 60mm f2.8 that would focus from infinity to 2-time macro. Now you've got this cost-effective alternative from Pergear, actually half the cost of the Laowa at only $180 US. Now, if you are shooting on a full frame camera at infinity, you will get a little bit of vignetting on both the Laowa and the Pergear. But of course, if you're shooting with an APS-C camera or you're doing macro, you're not going to encounter any issues with vignetting. Anyway, hopefully someone out there got something out of this one. If so, consider leaving me a thumbs up. If not, that's okay too. If you want to make sure you don't miss any of these episodes in the future, please consider subscribing. If you've got any ideas for future episodes, please leave those in the comments below. And until next time, keep working to make your chosen idea a reality. Peace.